Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 27th episode of Tides of Lore. My name is Robert Silva. I am one half of your host team, joined as always by my good friend Tim. How we doing this week, Tim?
I'm doing great, man. Grinding in Classic. I don't know if you saw me doing the Alterac Valley PvP grind, but that was something. Rank 9 right now. I don't know. 13 seems like an amazing goal to try to reach, but holy crap, man, it is a little mind-numbing, just to say. It's gonna have to be like hundreds of hours of doing that, so I might reconsider, but I'm doing that. And I'm farming bis, bro. I got the healing gloves, the paladin plate ones from Hakar. I was the only one who SR'd it, so, which is a soft reserve, and they just gave it to me because, you know, I was the only one who soft reserved it. So that was cool. That was cool. But I've just been playing a little bit of Classic. What about you, Big Dog?
I've been mostly playing retail when I have the time to. We got on a horrific vision grind for a bit yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
Where we collected, I think, like 3 mounts overall: the griffin, the horse, and the male muncher.
Oh yeah, we did get the male muncher drop, dude. Yeah, thank you. You definitely were running the strats and everything. I just kind of tagged along, but I appreciate that. That was fun.
I only knew so much from when I was grinding the legacy version of it, but they added a bunch more, and we also, you know, set ourselves up to get more mounts, more masks, more mementos.
Ooh,
from
the death cycle
next week that's gonna come out.
The death cycle, we started that
tomorrow. So we're gonna pick that up. Hasn't been necessarily cheap because I don't do engineering or anything like that. I also told you that they had the Void like Crystal Saber or whatever it was, one of those jewel crafting mounts that you could get. And I was looking at my professions on my main. I'm like, you know, my mining is still at level 1. I could drop mining and pick up jewel crafting to do that.
Do you don't need a specific level to do that? You can just,
I think the Wowhead or whatever it was said that you needed like jewel crafting 30 in the War Within, which, I mean,
that's not
doesn't sound terrible, right? I mean,
well,
yeah, it's pretty easy.
You can also
probably grind that out.
You can also make a couple mounts that I think only jewel crafters can use. I could be wrong. I think there's other mounts you could do too.
Yeah, I have not really explored that portion. I don't do many professions outside of like playing hardcore and getting alchemy up or whatever, so I'm not too informed on those, and I haven't really focused on mounts from professions since back when I had like 100 mounts to my name, and I was like, I need carpet, or I need a flying machine. So that's all going to be pretty new to me as well, but did that mostly. I've seen that a lot of people are happy that they removed the time gate requirement, at least partially, for the horrific visions. So
what do you mean?
That's
it still seems time gated.
Kind of what got me on.
Like the
The upgrades are time gated, but before you needed to have the tech tree completely filled out before you could buy any of the mounts. So thankfully, we aren't doing that. But outside of that, I've been starting up the new Doom Dark Ages game, which, if I'm to be 100% candid, I'm not the biggest fan of, and like that's for a multitude of reasons. If anyone cares, I don't think that the combat flows as well as it did in Eternal or even Doom 2016. And also, Mick Gordon, the guy that made the music for both the Doom games and the latest Wolfenstein games, is no longer the one that made the soundtrack for it. And I was just like, something doesn't hit quite the same. And I mean, hell, when I was even writing up this episode, I was jamming out to the old Doom music. So I really love that music. It's a shame that he's not back, but I'll probably finish that up, and I'm looking to move on to that very highly renowned game that a ton of people have been talking about, Claire Obscure Expedition 33.
Yeah, the turn-based one.
It's like, I've never, like, I think you compared it to like Paper Mario or something like that, where it gives you the option to like do quick time events or whatever you want to call them within the actual turn base of it, and that's something that really fascinated me because I've never played a turn-based game like that. I think like the only turn-based games that I've really dove into at all are like Pokemon. So
yeah, now take what I said with a grain of salt. I've not seen any gameplay, and I'm just making that a correlation based off of what they told me how the game feels like. So That's
Well,
just what
and
I assume it's like. Like in Paper Mario, you could like hit A right before you jump on them, and you do like extra damage, or you take like less damage if you hit it like when someone hits you. So it made it feel more interactive in that game, but I don't know if that's how it is in that game.
yeah, I watched our friend Bub play it for a while, and it was definitely significantly more interactive than I had initially anticipated. So I'm gonna give that a try, see if I enjoy that at all, and I'm sure by next week you guys will probably be hearing about me talk about that. That's mostly what I've been up to this last week, outside of obviously preparing this here podcast, where last week we discussed some pretty big baddies, some Burning Legion origins, some old gods breaking out of prison. What do you remember about last week, Tim?
I remember us talking about like kind of the Titans in general, setting the stage of how they kind of became like the Pantheon, I think is what they call themselves. I mean, we talked about Sargeras and TBC, but we kind of talked about more of like who Sargeras was and like why he turned against the Pantheon. But just like how Titans become, we talked about Yogg-Saron, and that's how we tied it into Northrend. Is Yogg-Saron beneath Ulduar, which is like this big Titan facility in Northrend, and how he like sowed his seeds of corruption into Loken, and what was Loken's friend name? What was his name?
His brother, Thorum's wife, Sif.
How they let themselves get corrupted as well and wage a war that just caused a lot of destruction that did not need to happen.
Yep. We did talk a bit about like the Frost Giants as well as a handful of the other Titan Keepers, kind of how they came to be. We sort of discussed how Mimron became a mechanome. We discussed how the Frost Giants ended up basically having an unjust war waged upon them by some of the other Titan forge that exist in Northrend because of Thorum's, I guess not confusion, but deception being turned against them by Loken, and how that all kind of went down, as well as just a handful of what you would do as the players when you're questing through the area of the Storm Peaks. But I think that, for the most part, was it. It was a pretty long story, and, I mean, in fairness, we're going to be getting into some pretty long stories here today as well, as we move into some of the other zones of the Northrend invasion campaign. And also last week, we did have a handful of comments from our loyal followers, so we're going to hop into those, starting off with Nooch21 saying, something that I've noticed that no one really talks about is that during Warcraft 3, the Frozen Throne, Arthas was losing strength with each mission that you completed. From what I recall, his entire reason for going back to the helm and putting it on, becoming the Lich King, was to stop his decline. So even with his power dropping, the part where he fights and wins against Illidan makes him seem like even more of a monster. And I responded to that because, I mean, that is a great point. Like, even we discussed in the episode where, like, we don't really see the Lich King take, like, basically any damage after he puts the helm on until pretty far down in the storyline. And him only getting at all close to losing to Illidan, if you even want to consider it that, is only because he's basically having fucking heart attacks and stuff like that. So, yeah, that is pretty impressive. I also just thought, to build off top of that, it kind of gives me a perspective of just how crazy powerful Uther must have been. Because, I mean, during the original Warcraft 3 Reigns of Chaos campaign, obviously you as Arthas go and you fight Uther. But in the novel, they give it such a detailed description of how Uther is like a half second away from crushing Arthas's chest cavity with his hammer until the Blade of Frostmourne, basically of its own mind, saves him. And yeah, I thought that was like an interesting concept because, I mean, there's like, you basically have Arthas, the champion of death for Death Knights or whatever you want to consider them, the Lich King, and Uther, this, embodiment of the light, who is, them two clashing. Pretty big battle when you really think about it.
Can you explain why Arthas was losing power with each mission?
The reason why he even goes to Northrend in the first place, because as we mentioned kind of before, he is just chilling out in Lordaeron when suddenly he's like having heart attacks and he's beginning to lose control of the Scourge, which is where Sylvanas will break free from him. But I think the like lore reason for why he even started losing power is because when Illidan uses the Eye of Sargeras to fracture Northrend, it begins to have some of the power of the Frozen Throne and the like actual Lich King Helm of Domination leak out. So he's losing control over it, and that is why he'll eventually go up there to, unite with the Helm and I guess solidify his power over the Helm of Domination and stuff like that. But we did also have the Time Lost Crow coming in to say it's nice to finally know the difference between the Darkfallen and the Sand Lane. Previously, I just got the impression that they were pretty much elevated undead elves. I guess I wasn't really far off. And he also mentions, I am normally listening to the podcast while I'm doing my delves or playing Hearthstone. And to build off top of that, I mentioned, I was like, yeah, honestly, you're not far off. I mean, they are still, like, we had a big discussion about how the confusion of what is a Darkfallen, what is a Sand Lane. We kind of really got into that ourselves. And I mean, he basically is right. They are just essentially elevated Darkfallen to be the royalty or the leadership over the Scourge army. And also, I did want to mention, I was like, at this point, I barely understand Hearthstone. But with that being the case, and to tie it into him talking about delves, they did, in the most recent expansion, bring in what are the Hearthstone characters and like the major ones that you'll see there, like Elise Starseeker and obviously Brand Bronzebeard, as well as Reno Jackson, Sir Finley Merlington, I think is his name. It's a Murloc. And they're now like the quest hub in the most recent expansion for World of Warcraft for doing delves and going into these like, they're not, for those of you who don't play World of Warcraft, they're not like full dungeons. They're more like kind of mini dungeons in a way. So with them being brought in from the Hearthstone stuff, which is up to this point considered non-canon. I mean, there are plenty of characters in the Hearthstone universe that that are already dead. Like, for example, Onyxia or Katana Prestor is one of the major like villains throughout the Hearthstone storylines, and obviously she's been dead for a while. So. But having them come into the story, I think that they could really introduce what is another one of these main villains from the Hearthstone experience, which is this ethereal by the name of Rafam, who's kind of, I mean, for the longest time that I've known, kind of one of the biggest bads in the story of Hearthstone. And I think that he would be perfect as the next like Underpin or the next Zekfir that could be like this big boss at the end of one of these delves.
You and Time Lost are very similar. You both love Hearthstone and you both love delves.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also like that character in specific is really cool because like his whole thing is usually like stealing magical artifacts, and I could just imagine like the phases in that fight, like he busts out all these magical artifacts that we've seen throughout the history of Warcraft and just been like, start fucking you up with them as you're, doing this delve. So I think that would be really cool, and I just love Hearthstone. They do give you amazing artwork from the game that I just wouldn't have exist if you were strictly only playing Warcraft or World of Warcraft. And as you guys have heard over the last few podcasts, we've been including more and more voice lines from the game, and a lot of those come from Hearthstone, as well as like the music stingers that come along with them. So I love the vibe of Hearthstone. I just hate the impact it has on my wallet, as most card games tend to do to people.
Yeah, that's probably the reason I don't play it. I don't know. Maybe I'm old or disconnected, but buying digital cards to use for digital games seems, I don't know, kind of ridiculous in my opinion. But that's just my opinion.
I will say, back when I was still playing it, which is just prior to, I think, the Demon Hunter class being added to the game, it was a lot easier to acquire gold and acquire dust, which is what you use to craft cards and purchase packs and stuff like that without having to spend real-world money. I have heard that over the recent years, it is much more monetized, significantly less good. And even when I was playing, I remember I would drop like $100 on card packs just to try and get certain ones. But thankfully, put that down.
Yeah, like I like buying Pokemon cards, and I'll play with Pokemon cards sometimes, but I mainly buy them to have them, collect them. So maybe that's why my disconnect is there. I don't know.
Well, and as much as I hate resellers, the option to do something with those physical cards still exists afterwards. Once you have the Hearthstone card on your account, you can't do anything. You can turn it into dust and try and, make other cards with it, but even that is just like not really worth it to the same degree.
Yeah.
So We did also have Trace the Dawn returning from last episode. Welcome back, saying, God, I love this podcast. It feels like you're sitting at a table having a conversation and a sip of coffee with two friends. I love every episode, and I can't wait for the next. He did also go on to say, and then there's the Infinite Dragonflight, which I find to be a very interesting faction, but never quite hits the right spot. I haven't played Dragonflight, so I don't really know the lore from there, but I always believed that the Infinite Flight was a void-corrupted faction with the goal to destroy the United Azeroth. You'll have Wrathion say, United Azeroth is essentially undefeatable. So I always thought that they drove the Bronze crazy with promises of undoing their death, and they got showed early in their life. And I haven't really done too much Dragonflight stuff, too. I do know the generalized story of the Infinite Flight, and we are going to save it for when we do actually reach the Dragonflight expansion. But a lot of the story that we get from Dragonflight is that maybe the Titans and their order magic isn't as, all-knowing or all pure that we've initially been having it made out to be over the years up till at least that expansion. But I don't know if they're really going to dive into that, because even in that same expansion, you have this huge conflict with Tyr and the Proto-Drakes and stuff like that, and it seems to have just kind of disappeared.
Has the Infinite Flight actually succeeded in corrupting the Time Ways? Because, I don't think they have, unless they have and we just don't know because they have, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not something we would really know anyway. It's more like something that the Bronze Dragons would know, and again, it's really frustrating because, just to get into that story a little bit, is that, they obviously have this idea that there is only this one timeline that needs to be kept pure. And in that Dragonflight expansion, they begin to kind of question, maybe it's not wrong to have alternate timelines, because if there weren't alternate timelines, then those versions of life wouldn't exist at all either. So maybe it's just them being zealous. But we'll discuss more of that as we get closer to Dragonflight and can actually dive into that story and get what you guys think more about that in detail. But lastly, we do have an extra comment today. I just wanted to throw this one in here because it's nice and short and we love that. And we have, I'm going to assume, is Pixel saying, I actually play WoW while listening to you guys. So, we love to hear that. We did ask last time, what do you guys get up to while you're playing World of Warcraft? And I did end up asking him, so what do you do in World of Warcraft? Are you a keystone pusher, a hardcore raider, maybe a mount collector? And I did want to throw this in here because that's kind of the question I just want to push on to everybody at this point. I'm curious, what do you guys do when you play WoW? Me and Tim have expressed that we love playing to collect mounts. We love to occasionally, push mythic keys, or occasionally do some PvP for Tim and our friend Bub. I'm curious what you guys get into. Are you guys always trying to progress the latest raid? Are you guys just legacy farmers for the most part like I am? Let us know. But that is all that we had for last week. And this week we are getting back to Northrend to talk about the remaining zones that we have yet to discuss before we move into the land of Icecrown and kind of complete our war against the Lich King. So let's just jump into that. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to Tides of Lore on YouTube, or if you're on Spotify, leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps the channel and ensures you won't miss a moment of this adventure. Now let's get started. And this week, we're going to be moving into the area of Northrend known as Zul'Drak, which, as you might notice, if you do know the naming system in WoW, is a troll name, which we did kind of mention all the way back. I believe episode 16 was our troll episode, that there were certain factions of these trolls during the Kyr troll war that would spread all across Azeroth, but ones that specifically went all the way up to the northern areas by the name of the Drakuru. And today we're going to talk a bit more about the Drakuru and at least their storyline, what they've get up to in the Wrath of the Lich King, because ever since that story, we've basically heard nothing about them. So let's get into that.
You can't turn your back on destiny, man.
Starting with this deal that you make when you're actually questing through the Grizzly Hills zone of Northrend, where during this quest where you go to the ruins of Drak'Tharon, you encounter this troll by the name of Drakuru, who is all trapped in a cage and is near this area of the Granite Springs, and he tasks you with capturing some of his fellow ice trolls who he's like, they go against the Drakari Empire. They're trying to fuck us up. And he proposes that you go to help him so that he can get more information and learn about this area known as Drak'Tharon Keep, this ancient Drakari troll fortress. And I mean, for the most part, to keep it kind of simple, you do this. You go and you collect all sorts of reagents for him. This is the quest that gives you the troll mojo, if you remember that. And you kind of have to go to certain like pyres and whatnot, and he can basically magically keep in touch with you because you'll put the mojo into the fire and he'll appear as a spirit in front of you.
What?
And yeah, you just go through.
Wasn't there a huge undead T-Rex or something in that dungeon? Do you remember that?
Yes, you're talking about King Dread, who, yes, is a... Well, I guess he's not undead. I think he's just a giant fucking dinosaur. I don't even think he's undead, but he does stand in a graveyard.
Yeah, I remember that. And then he like fears you and you're running around. Dude, I loved that. Like, Wrath of the Lich King had such diverse vibes in each zone. It's pretty crazy. It might be one of the most diverse like expansions.
I think the only one that even kind of competes is maybe like Legion. And I guess in fairness, Cataclysm has a bunch of zones that are like not at all the same, but they are just kind of different parts of Azeroth that have already been, for the most part, explored, and their vibe has been seen. But yeah, I'm pretty much inclined to agree that is probably the most diverse. I guess if we want to be fair, Shadowlands has some diverse zones because they're all different in a very unique way, but
we don't talk about Shadowlands.
Boo Shadowlands.
No, anytime we talk about the story, we're not referencing that part.
Fair enough. But yeah, I think Legion also had some really different zones, at least in my opinion, because, you know, some parts of it were like this magical elf city that had been destroyed and were now taken over by Naga, and now, you know, an actually massive city that we finally get to see that is, you know, full of arcane mages and mountains full of Tauren and dragons and all sorts of shit like that.
You talking about this whole, whole story is just flooding memories of Wrath of the Lich King.
Yep. So we help him out. We help Drakuru out. We collect these artifacts for him, like this Eye of the Prophets and this Heart of the Ancients and these Drakari tablets. And eventually, you know, bring them all to him, and then he's like, cool, great. Bring me, or summon me up to the Drak'Tharon Keep. And this is once again one of those times where you're like, damn, maybe if you would ask like even the smallest amount of questions, you would realize that this guy isn't a cool guy. Kind of like we were talking about when we discussed resurrecting Terran Gorfine back on Outland. You bring him all this stuff, and ultimately he's just like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm gonna betray you now. I've kind of been promised some pretty sick power by the Lich King, so I'm gonna do that. And with that being the case, he now has, you've basically given him the keys to take over Drak'Tharon Keep, and now it has become this outpost for the Scourge army where he begins to do these experiments on his own people and give them the blessings of the Lich King, where I mean, for the most part, like I said, this is kind of a quest line that leads into Zul'Drak from the Grizzly Hills, and at this point you kind of move into the area of Zul'Drak itself, where you are kind of summoned by the Argent Crusade, who we mentioned are the faction formed from the Argent Dawn that have collected together to undo the evils of the Scourge. And as you arrive in Zul'Drak, you find on both sides of you some pretty fucked up people, because you are there and you're in essentially the middle of this civil war, because there are still this faction of the Drakari that are alive and want to keep it that way, but don't necessarily have the means to, so they're searching for any source of power that they can. And then you have the undead version of the Drakari on the other side that are just clashing, and, well, you're essentially tasked with undoing both of them. So, with Drak'Tharon Keep fully under the Scourge control, the waves and waves of Scourge now have this strong foothold to push out and basically claim the entire zone, as well as they begin to push into the Grizzly Hills and fight with those Furbolg, who we kind of just helped out, kind of freed from corruption in their own right. And to discuss their little civil war, if you want to call it that, a little bit more, they like I said, the Drakari trolls, the living ones, they didn't just like lie down and be like, okay, we're Lich King servants now. No, there's like signs of a war for a decent while within Zul'Drak, where you'll find like crash necropoli and stuff like this, those massive structures that the Scourge fly around to kind of lord over different parts of Northrend. And, you know, it's indicated that they managed to shoot these down. I don't know how a troll would do that, but, you know, good on them for it, right? Unfortunately, this crash necropoli didn't quite kill all of these, like, Nerubian spellcasters that were inside of it. So they come popping out, and they actually see a bunch of these Argent Crusaders who had been rushing over to investigate the impact, and they're like, oh, you guys would make great soldiers for the Scourge. So they killed them. They raised them as soldiers for the Scourge, and now the Drakari, the living ones, are even more outnumbered in this battle, as we are, you know, kind of, again, caught in the middle of it. But to discuss why the living Drakari are even bad is they have kind of fully, what's the word I'm looking for? They've kind of seen that their kingdom's on the brink of destruction, so they do something that is definitely taboo even amongst trolls, which is they turn on their own gods. We mentioned the Loa plenty of times in the past, the wild gods that are worshipped by the trolls. And seeing that they are basically going to lose this battle, they look to the Loa and they're like, hey, we need more power. And the Loa is like, no more power to give. Sorry. And the Drakari are like, I think I could figure out a way to make you turn into more power. So they actually imprison these Loa and begin sacrificing them to do blood rituals and empower themselves. And with this, it does manage to give them this the Loa's essence that they've been sacrificing, granting them some strength to repel these Scourge. But in doing so and bathing in this blood of their gods, they are also going insane.
Does it say which Loa are they in prison?
We know that at least one of them is this Loa Panthers, this cat goddess by the name of Harkoa, who is this like snow panther with these glowing blue eyes and like this frost breath, who you do manage to save before they get sacrificed by the Drakari. So that's one of them, as well as inside of, these guys got such fucking crazy names, as well as this bear Loa by the name of Runok, who ends up getting, I believe they actually do get sacrificed and die, but they're, through your actions as the heroes, you manage to like make sure their soul goes on to the afterlife and they're not completely corrupted forever.
To Ardenweald.
But yeah, you're getting it now. Wow. There we go.
I'm learning.
Yes, sir. But yeah, for the most part, just these different Loa, all the ones that they essentially had up there with them, they start to just cannibalize their power to gain for themselves. And yeah, that's where I was talking about. We come in, we are in the middle of this war between these fanatical Drakari, warped by the divine blood of their gods, and the Scourge Drakari on the other side. And someone else who's actually there that I think we haven't really seen since Zul'Garub is you encounter the Zandalari trolls, who we mentioned were kind of the mecca, the start, or at least the most major civilization of the Troll Empire for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And they're actually up there. But they're there not to help out these Drakari, because, I mean, usually when we've seen the Zandalari before, they're like, we need to help out our buddies. We need to reestablish the, you know, rightful rule of the trolls. They're actually here just to make sure that when the Drakari Empire collapses, that there is a written record of it and it's not lost forever.
Oh, that is hard.
So yeah, that is why they are up there for this time.
Dang.
And you begin helping out the Argent Crusade. You begin helping out them to undo the insanity that's going on in Zul'Drak, which is eventually where you are then tasked with going into Gundrak, which is that the original capital city of the Drakari that the living Drakari still live from. And you go in there, and I mean, it's pretty much exactly what it looks like. You got a bunch of chained up, slain wild gods, the Loa, which is radiating with foul energy, and these Drakari high prophets that have been empowered by them, giving them this blasphemous strength. And I believe even the last boss of this, he turns into like a rhino and starts like sending you fucking flying and stuff like that.
Yeah, you gotta interrupt it. And every time you interrupt it, it goes faster and faster.
So you go in there, we're the heroes of this story, so at the end of the day, we do manage to slay them all and put an end to this portion of the Drakari Empire, where with Zul'Drak now burning and the Drakari in disarray, you are then tasked with going into that other facility of Drak'Tharon Keep that you so happily handed over. And in there, you'll find certain other people that used to like rule over this land that have been raised as Scourge, like the prophet Tharanja, who is now appears as this twisted skeleton that looks a lot like Hakar, if you remember that from inside there. We don't know too much about them, but we do know that apparently they have a real fondness for flaying flesh of their people.
Well, do you remember what he does? He's the last boss. He turns you into a skeleton, and then you have to use like these skeleton abilities. It's pretty crazy.
Yes, that's part of the reason I guess he loves flesh so much.
Yeah, he steals yours.
But give that back, that's mine. But you do mostly go in there looking for clues on how to stop that troll that we gave the keys of Zul'Drak to Drakuru. And you do eventually clear out this dungeon, and by doing this, you do learn a little bit about how to subvert Drakuru. And it's basically that he is fanatical in being loyal to the Lich King, but if you show him that you're also fanatically loyal to the Lich King, he is more than willing to imbue you with great power. So we, by disguising ourselves as some of these undead trolls, do this quest chain where eventually he's like, wow, you're actually, super loyal, and I want to give you power. So initially, he's going to turn you into what is known as one of these Blightblood Trolls, which are dire trolls. And to just break down what both of those are, dire trolls in general are just trolls that have been imbued with such great power that they are like these hulking monstrosities. Kind of like how we spoke about the dire orcs being, like when they pump them with enough fell magic, they turn into these super buff monstrosities. You can do something real similar if you pump the trolls full of undead magic. And he's like, I'm going to do that to you. And you're like, ooh, actually, I've got this stick of yours known as the Scepter of Domination, and I'm going to just have your trolls kick your ass. And after a short fight and him getting his ass kicked by his own dudes, he gets cornered and overwhelmed, and he calls upon the Lich King. And he's like, please come help me, I beg you. And, well, the Lich King does show up, but he's just like, yeah, clearly I chose wrong, and you're garbage. So he just chops his head off. And as his head goes rolling away, the Lich King looks to you, and he just says, like, I'm going to spare your life because you managed to amuse me, but no, if we pass cross again, it's not going to be this simple. And then he leaves. Kind of typical bad guy shit where he's like, I'll let you live just this once.
Well, he does that multiple times. I remember in Boring Tundra, I think. Like, there's so many times you see him and he's just like, nah, not now. But I guess that's kind of his plan, right?
I mean, we'll discuss more of it in ICC, but he does definitely seem to be egging you on, right? Yeah. Yep. So, with the death of Drakuru, with the death of these fanatical Drakari, Zul'Drak, for the most part, has been dealt with. We do know later on in the story that the Scourge managed to kind of hold on to this position even long after the war with the Lich King, but they're not a threat like the other lands of Northrend are. So, with that, we're actually going to move into some of the other lands of Northrend. There is really only one other zone we haven't discussed until we move into the actual zone of Icecrown itself, which is the Sholazar Basin. And the Sholazar Basin is kind of just this anomaly of Northrend. We've kind of discussed how most of Northrend is like this frozen wasteland. Some of it's more like a mountainous, snow-covered peak region, kind of like the Grizzly Hills are. But Sholazar Basin is a lush jungle full of rivers and water and life. And it's because all the way back when the Titans shaped Azeroth, they appointed Freya, right? Freya, the keeper of life.
Life, nature, all flourish under my care.
To oversee the world's ecosystems and bring life to Azeroth. And there were 3 specific regions that we know that she kind of created. The ones that we know of are the Ungoro Crater, the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, and this location of the Sholazar Basin, where they're essentially like laboratories in a way for the Titan Keepers to kind of play with life, see what works, see what's going on, see how it all interacts with each other. And when you look at Sholazar Basin and you look at at least the Ungoro crater, they're basically the same zone in terms of appearance.
Yeah, they're very similar. I think don't you have a quest that you like even go to Ungoro from there?
And that's going to be right here at the end of this story. You go there and you fly in. You look around. For the most part, a lot of the stories in Sholazar Basin are kind of like on the macro scale. They don't really affect things on a grander scale. The main one that you encounter when you go within this location is you have this conflict that you basically are once again thrown right in the middle of, where there's one side of these native tribes known as the Oracles, who are this species known as the Gorloks, these frog-like humanoids who Bran Bronzebeard theorizes are these kind of long-lost ancestors of the Murlocs that we famously know all about Azeroth. So, and they're fighting with this other tribal race known as the Frenzy Heart. And they're this race known as the Wolfar, and they're like Wolverine-like humanoid creatures. So you arrive, and they just fucking hate each other. They're going to war nonstop, just battling, and eventually you do enough quest chains throughout this zone, and you pick which side that you want to help out. I don't think either side's really canon, but...
Well, you gotta choose the Gerlach side because... they have the mount. They have the mount, right? The green.
Yep,
the green
you need that mount. Oh god, I hate that mount so much. I love that mount. It's a cool mount. It's just one of those mounts again where I opened like 50 eggs before I finally got it.
Mine was like the third egg.
Yeah, we know, Tim. We know.
I'm just saying. But beautiful mount.
Great mount. So you go there, and just to break down some of these races a little bit more, the Oracles, like I said, they're Gorloks, and they're like these eccentric creatures that have almost developed shamanism or mysticism through connection with the wilds. And one of the other things that Bran Bronzebeard did, like, kind of theorizes for their race is that they were possibly created by another of the wild gods that we'll eventually meet by the name of Krogwa, this frog deity, frog Loa, if you will. And they have this reverence for water and the healing abilities of water, essentially. For the most part, that is what goes on with them. And just to talk about the Wolvar and the Frenzy Heart tribe just a little bit, they are considered to actually be one of the more stable and peace-loving of their kind. We know from, I think it was a Blizzard post when they described the zones itself, that they were actually driven out of their original homelands by the Scourge when they'll eventually find the land of Sholazar Basin and, begin to fight with the Gorloks because they're like, this is mine now. And the Gorloks are like, nuh-uh. So that is kind of the whole plot of why they fight with each other so much. And to get into the deeper story of Sholazar Basin, because like I said, this is like the macro scale of it. There is the major story within Sholazar Basin, and that is you go in there and you're actually tasked by one of the professors that you'll eventually encounter with going to find this entity that they call the Life Warden. So you go into Sholazar Basin and you look around and you find this figure known as the Life Warden, and it is an avatar of Freya. Like we said, Freya actually at this time is currently all locked up in Ulduar because of Loken, but Freya actually made the avatar of Freya as a failsafe to watch over the Sholazar Basin if ever she was unable to. So, good on her. Nice to have a backup plan, and it, for the most part, actually worked. But there is another problem, because the avatar of Freya, she recognizes you as, well, you're not Scourge, but I don't know if I've ever seen anyone like you. What are you doing here? And you tell her, you're like, we came to investigate. We're warring with the Scourge right now. And she's like, oh, good, because we have these massive pillars. I believe there's 5 of them. These Titan pylons that used to be all around the Sholazar Basin that were interlinked that basically created this magical barrier preventing any dangerous entities or factions from entering into the Sholazar Basin. And, well, one of those pillars has been blown the fuck up. the Lifeblood Pillar. And she kind of tasks you initially with proving your loyalty to, the living and life itself by going to this pylon and fighting off a bunch of these Scourge while trying to determine how it is that the Scourge even managed to break through. Because like we said, they shouldn't have been able to have got in. And that's why this land is so preserved from the Scourge in general. And you find out they didn't just mana bomb it or some shit, but that the living members of the Scourge, who we know are the Cult of the Damned, managed to get through because, well, they're still just living life and normal at this point, and they're the ones that did it. And this revelation kind of shocks Freya, who doesn't necessarily, couldn't even before conceptualize that life would try and destroy life like this. She's like, what the fuck is wrong with them?
They're warlocks. That's what's wrong with them.
Necromancers, but yeah.
That's crazy. Question about the pillars. Un'Goro Crater seems to have similar pillars. So did they have a shield at one point too?
I don't think so, because I think they actually have this other weapon for the most part that takes care of Un'Goro Crater. And that's where we're going to talk about comes into play here at the end too. So you help Freya to decipher how the Scourge got in, how the destruction of this Lifeblood Pillar even occurred. You go into this mine where the Scourge are mining out the heart of this pillar, this red stone that doesn't really come into the story, but, we don't want the Scourge to have any more power than they already got. So you go in there, you stop this desecration of this Titan facility or relic or whatever you want to call it, and begin to progress in stopping the corruption of this area by the Scourge. And eventually you go back to Freya and she's like, that's great. The pillar's probably not going to get rebuilt. And also the Scourge are now attacking another one of the pillars known as the Glimmering Pillar. When I think about this, I don't really know why this is necessary, because it seems like you need all of these pillars activated at once to protect the area, but maybe they're just looking for more shining crystals, eh? And with that being the case, you're sent to the Glimmering Pillar. Freya gives you this horn where you go to the top of it and you blow this horn. And when you do, it channels the power of the avatar of Freya into this pillar as well. And it just shoots out these beams of light that fry all of these cultists and all of these Scourge that are nearby and pushes them back, at least for a little bit, for this time. But that is where you go back to the Life Warden. And you're like, hey, we saved the Glimmering Pillar. Things are good. And she's like, okay, yeah, that's great. We need a more surefire plan of keeping the Scourge out of here. So I'm going to task you with locating this hidden defense mechanism that the Titans created. And she says that it's a creation of unmatched power. So the first thing that you got to do is, to get back to what Tim was saying, you got to go around the zone and turn on all of these switches at all these different locations within the zone to activate what is known as the Waygate. And this Waygate, she's like, will take you to a land that's similar to this land. And she doesn't tell you exactly what it is at the time, but yeah, you go through, you do it, you go to the Shaper's Terrace, and eventually you flip all these switches, this Waygate opens, and you teleport through it to go locate this weapon that she's talking about, and it puts you into the Un'Goro Crater.
Yeah, I remember that. It was really cool. The gate's huge.
Massive.
Yeah.
And it kind of needs to be, because as you do arrive through this Waygate, and you're looking for this weapon that she's tasked you with finding, you enter, and you find this massive stone golem, known as the Etymidian, this massive stone colossus that has just been dormant for however many millennia, standing over the Un'Goro Crater. And you go into a nearby area, you find what is known as the Omega Rune, which is just this rune stone that eventually you socket into the chest cavity of the Etymidian, and it turns on back to life and is just like, am I needed somewhere? And you're like, yeah, you are. The other place on the other side of the gate, they could really use you right now. So he's like, oh, okay, gotcha. And you have him walk back through the Waygate. And he looks around and he's like, yep, corruption detected. Fucking kill mode activated.
Nice. Do you control it? Is it one of those vehicle battles?
Yeah,
that Wrath is famous for.
Oh, everyone's favorite vehicle battles. I would say this one's actually pretty cool because I think the best vehicle battles in Wrath are the ones where you're just slaughtering waves after waves of these, tiny enemies while you're a massive creature. And that's basically exactly what it is, because it detects all these Scourge in the area, and you ride along this Colossus, and it is just this spectacle of destruction. You are tasked with killing like 200 Scourge, as well as these massive like flesh golems and abominations that come after you, and with little effort, he just boom dead, boom dead, boom dead, fucking punting all these ghouls into the sky, I imagine. And you do, using the Etymidian, manage to essentially destroy any Scourge presence within the Sholazar Basin. And you then return to the Avatar of Freya, and she just thanks you. She's like, thank you for ensuring that life continues to bloom in this land of death. And with that, you've now completed, for the most part, the Sholazar Basin questline, unless you're coming back here every day to do dailies for those fucking oracles. Thank you for tuning in to Tides of Lore. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your fellow adventurers. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you. But with the completion of Sholazar Basin, with the completion of the Zul'Drak questline, like I said, that only really leaves one location in Northrend remaining, and that is the land that the Lich King rules over with an iron fist, Icecrown. And the last time we tried to bust into Icecrown, it didn't go great. The Horde and the Alliance tried to push through the Wrath Gate. The Blight was unleashed upon them by this rebel faction of the Forsaken, and it just led to a massive slaughter of both sides and both factions. But now, returning to the kind of faction hub that you would call it of Dalaran that floats over top of the Crystal Song Forest, you have been once again granted a quest by one of your leadership to begin a renewed assault on Icecrown. But this time, we're just gonna fly, because either if you're on a Horde or you're on Alliance, you'll end up getting on one of these airships known as either the Skybreaker for the Alliance or the Horde's Ogrim's Hammer, which are these just two massive aircraft that are just like, I think Man of War, if you understand what a ship in real life is of naval battles, but for the sky. So flying ship, lots of guns, can kill a lot of things at one time. And you enter Icecrown, you're flying overhead, kind of scouting, and that's when you're tasked by another person upon these airships to go and meet the Argent Crusade at an area known as the Argent Vanguard. This forward base, kind of just to the other side of Icecrown, that has managed to blow a hole in the mountain next to, kind of a little bit to the west of the Wrathgate, that will serve as the tip of the spear in pushing into the lands of the Lich King. And that's where you're going to meet up with another figure that we've talked about pretty well in detail, the High Lord Tyrion Fordring, current bearer of the Ashbringer.
Put your faith in the light.
And you talk with Tyrion, you're like, hey man, I'm here to help you out. And he kind of expresses how he's fucking pissed that the Alliance and Horde cannot focus on the bigger problem, but instead he implores you to sign up with the Argent Crusade and, put any differences that your faction may have aside while you focus on dealing with the Scourge. And, well, we're the heroes. Somebody's got to do it. And you join up with the Argent Crusade to begin pushing into Icecrown.
I remember doing like a Proto Drake quest. They captured Proto Drakes, which is pretty cool.
I think they raised him, because I could be wrong. I think the guy is actually like a dragon in disguise. I could be wrong on that, but he got a weird name anyway. It's like Primatus or something like that. But yeah, the Green Proto Drake quest.
But I love, this is the start of like the vibe of the like Lich King and death and destruction that he brings. And you're like flying through Icecrown. It's the music too, dude. Boom, 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 boom. If you remember that, I don't know if I'm just going crazy making noises, but I distinctly remember that in Wrath.
Like I've always mentioned, I think it gives a great vibe for whatever you're doing in World of Warcraft. Art team, music team, always killing it in World of Warcraft. You are then tasked by Tyrion Fordring to begin this initial incursion into Icecrown, where you, like we mentioned, you fly on the back of these green proto-drakes and you go to rescue any of these crusade survivors that have managed to survive but have essentially been stuck behind enemy lines, because when the Argent Crusade initially blew the hole through this mountain, they rushed forward into this area known as Scourgeholm. But, well, the Scourge immediately mounted a counterattack that was just brutal, and they were forced to be pushed back to that other location that we were talking about, the Argent Vanguard. And again, now you're the counterattack. So you go in there, you rescue these crusade survivors with the assistance of these green proto-drakes, and then as you begin to push further into Icecrown, you establish this small foothold near Scourgeholm, and once again, another Scourge counterattack. But this time, thankfully, we brought some goblin tech, because they're like, yeah, we actually got these cannons. They're called the Argent Cannons, made by goblins, pretty sick already, also been blessed with holy water by this priest by the name of Father Gustav. So you hop on these cannons, and to kind of build off of what you said before, where it's like this feels like where it's like really just like mounting this battle against the undead. I think that the campaign in this zone is one of the few times that it really felt like you were like battling for every single step to get into an area. Like you were, constantly fighting wave after wave of enemy to finally be able to establish any amount of foothold within Icecrown. And it only gets more and more difficult as you push in. You just constantly see your guys as losing ground and having to go help them to gain it back. And it's one of the few experiences that feel like you're not just constantly winning upwards, and instead it's like this actual war that you are constantly having to put effort in to ensure you're winning.
That's a great way to describe it, man. That's what I was saying earlier, the death and destruction. And dude, how many mobs there are, all undead, the huge ones too. Like, and you just click on them, you see how much health they have, and you're like, oh no, I'm good.
Yeah. So using these cannons, you have to once again kill hundreds of Scourge, as well as shooting down these transformed dragons known as the Frostworm, which are these giant skeletal dragons that come after you. You're just unleashing cannon fire into their ranks and shooting them down. And with that, you do manage to stabilize this front line and really just kind of get a small foot into the Icecrown area, which is where you're then tasked by Tyrion to go meet with another figure who he calls the Ebon Watcher. And you go and meet with this guy. And something cool that I actually didn't know about this, because I've never quested through this area as a Death Knight, is that if you go there and you meet with this figure as any other class besides a Death Knight, he's just known as the Ebon Watcher. And you don't really get too much detail on that. But if you are a Death Knight, you know that this figure is really the leader of the Knights of the Ebon Blade, Darian Morgraine.
No peace, no rest.
And because if you go up to him as any other class, you talk with him and he's just like, yes, the Scourge or blah, 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 we need to stop them. But if you go up to him as Death Knight, he's like, hey, dog, you've gotten really strong. I'm proud of you. Let's get in there. And this is what begins another quest line where you are beginning to push into that kind of fortress area known as Scourgeholm. Initially, you go in there and you're just tasked with killing as many Scourge as you can possibly while collecting what are known as Scourge Stones. And it says in the quest that these Scourge Stones are what the Scourge use to track and manage their forces. And they're hoping that if they collect enough of these Scourge Stones, they will be able to also understand the enemy's movements, where their armies are, and what they're planning next in future operations, if they can, manage to decipher, essentially, these Scourge Stones. So you go into Scourgeholm, you collect as many of these shiny rocks as you possibly can, and you bring them back to the Knights of the Ebon Blade. And they're like, cool, good job. And now it's time to go and kill the leadership in Scourgeholm. This time, the Knights of the Ebon Blade come with you. And you can have a bunch of, Death Knights that you originally would have seen when you did the Light's Hope Chapel questline for the Death Knight starting area, who you'll have come with you as you blow this horn to summon them. And also for the last one, none other than Darian Morgraine himself joins you to face this Scourge Lieutenant. And, well, we win. We manage to kill all of these Scourge lieutenants, essentially clear out most of the area from Scourge, and loosen the Lich King's grip on this region just a little bit. And with Scourge Home now taken, you report back to Tyrion. He tells you, all right, we need to establish a permanent stronghold within Icecrown that is of our own. So he gives you this blessed banner that has been, I don't know what makes it so blessed, but I can assume that it has just been soaked in holy water for 100 years or so.
Yeah.
And he tells you to take it over to what is called the Crusader's Pinnacle, which is actually just this pile of Crusader skulls that has been left by the Scourge, and it's called the Crusader's Pinnacle as a way to mock the Argent Crusade itself by the Scourge. But you take it there, you plant the banner in these skulls, and you fight off these Scourge as they come after you to try and prevent you from taking this land. But eventually you do manage to, I guess, purify this location, and eventually you make this a holy ground, really. And that is where they then begin to build up their keep, and it serves as this forward operating base within Icecrown known as Justice Keep. And upon establishing Justice Keep, you are now tasked with a whole bunch of things. Like, after you've reached this point in the quest line and the instance, or I guess this area of Northrend is actually changed into this quest hub, you just have a ton of quests that you can do. You can go help your faction, you can go do other things, but the quest that we're going to talk about today as we wrap up is this quest where you are tasked by Tyrion Fordring to go and locate this man by the name of Crusader Bradenbrad. And he mentions that the last time that they saw him, he was sieging the Death Gate just to the east of Scourgeholm. There's all these different walls within Northrend, and we mentioned that we tried to bust through the Wrath Gate. It didn't really work, but there is one that is within Icecrown that is called the Death Gate. And they all have these like really crazy names as well, very Lord of the Rings-esque. But he mentions, yeah, unfortunately that part of our Argent Crusade, they got fucked up and they lost and they were overwhelmed by the Scourge. But this figure, this Crusader Bradenbrad, was so honorable that it said he dragged over a dozen men back from the battlefield while fighting off this onslaught of enemies. And he wants you to go retrieve him so that he can honor this figure. And he's like, but I don't know where he is. The last time I saw him, he went like northeast and we haven't seen him since. So you go, and eventually you find this campfire that Bradenbrad's at. And he tells you, like, do not get near me. I have the plague of undeath. And he's like, just let me die here. Don't tell anyone to come get me. I do not want to infect anyone else. No one else should have to suffer this. And with that being the case, you go back to Tyrion, and Tyrion's just like, I refuse to let somebody who fought with such valor end in this way. So we're going to try and find a way to cure this plague of undeath. And that is when you go on a massive quest chain that sends you all over Azeroth that I think is just so cool, especially because of the deeper meaning, which we'll discuss at the end of this. First off, you are sent to go speak with this archdruid by the name of Liliandra, who's like, he's like, maybe the druids can help you out and they'll be able to figure out some way to do this. And she is like, yeah, we'll see if kind of our leader guy is able to help you out. She teleports you to the Moonglade in Kalimdor, where you'll meet up with Keeper Remulos, who you might remember is the son of Cenarius. And he's sympathetic. He's like, I think that we might be able to do it, but definitely not with any magic that exists in this world. So check the Emerald Dream, and maybe you can bring back something from there that will be able to help us out. So you go, he sends you into the Emerald Dream, where you are tasked with acquiring these acorns imbued with the dream's essence. And while you're there, you'll begin to see some signs that the dream's not doing as hot as it used to be. Because as you're in there, you'll come across corrupted figures of the Emerald Nightmare that as they approach you, they transform into you and try and attack you and kill you. But thankfully, we're better than that. We fight them off, we collect our acorns, and we return to Remulos, who then sends you back to Northrend. And you take this, what's known as the Boon of Remulos, to Crusader Bradenbrad. And you're like, hey, we're trying to purify you. We think we might be able to save you with these. And he's like, I thought I told you to fuck off. Because this is really what he says. He's like, I'm happy that you didn't send anyone else here, but I thought I told you just let me die. And you're like, yeah, apparently we're not doing that. So you plant this seed, and it imbues him with the dream's essence as it glows and radiates throughout his body a little bit. And it does manage to buy him time. He mentions, he's like, no, I still feel the plague within me, but, it doesn't burn as bad as it used to be. So with that being the case, you then go back to Tyrion and you tell him, you're like, yeah, didn't quite work. We might need something else. And he's like, okay, well, I think next we could try the aspect of life herself. So he sends you off to the Wormrest Temple to speak with the dragon aspect, Alexstrasza. And you go up there. As soon as she sees you, she's like, I can tell something's making you mad. What's going on? And you tell her your problem. She agrees to try and help with this task, and she sends you over to the Ruby Dragon Shrine, which is where the red dragons go to essentially die. And within this area, we kind of mentioned back during the Dragonblight episode that initially when you're questing through Dragonblight, you have to help to fight off these Scourge that are trying to corrupt this area. And you do that for the most part, but after you go to return to this dragon shrine, you find that the keeper of this land, who is once, I believe, a high elf or a night elf or something like that, some sort of elf, has been corrupted by undeath as well and turned into a banshee. She's like, Alexstrasza tells you, like, we're going to need to get her tears of this keeper. And you go in. This is that quest where it's underneath the tree in the Ruby Dragon Shrine, and you fight this banshee figure, eventually killing her and freeing her from the grips of undeath as well, while she then gives you what you're seeking, and you return it to Alexstrasza with these tears of, I believe her name's Dahlia? Yeah, the tears of Dahlia, and she blesses it with her dragon's fire so that you may take it over to Bradenbrad. And you do. You return to Bradenbrad once again, and you're like, hey, we got another, we got some more medicine for you. And you then basically plant that as well next to him, and all these wildflowers just begin to appear throughout the ice, and this warm magic fills the air, and Bradenbrad is still dying, unfortunately. This plague of undeath is even beyond dragon magic, it seems, but it's like a really sweet quest line, because he smiles at you, and he's like, as much as it sucks that I'm still going to die, it's great that I can see that there are people who are still willing to fight for goodness in this world. Like, you are truly a champion of goodness. But with that being the case, you're like, maybe one more thing can work. So you go back to Tyrion, and Tyrion's like, I only got one last guy I think could help us. So he sends you to Outland, to Shatrath City, to go speak with the Naru, a doll that resides inside the city, this being of pure light. And as you arrive in Shatrath City, you speak with a doll, and he greets you, saying, I already know why you're here. We've already foreseen this to come, and we're going to help you. And he's like, go back to Bradenbrad, and I promise that his soul will not fall to the Scourge. So you're like, okay, cool. Well, that was easy. You return to Northrend, return to Bradenbrad, and you find him fading out of life. You speak with him, and just as his breaths are shallow, his skin is turning pale, and he's nearing his end, he greets you one more time. He's just like, I told you again not to come back, but I am happy to see a familiar face as I pass. And he dies. As he's passing away, this light envelops his body, and a doll, two other Naru, Kuri and Mori, appear all around him as they raise his soul out of his body. And they mention how the light looks after its own. We would not let a champion of who did so much goodness fall to the undeath like this. And seems like a little fucked up thing to say, especially given what happens at the end of ICC. But we'll get there. We'll get there.
There's also that mountain of skulls that we were talking about.
Yeah, they weren't worth it. They weren't worth it. I will say, so just to finish this up so we can talk about the deeper meaning behind this quest line, is that they lift his soul out of his body, and they're like, he will never be raised to undeath, and I promise you that his soul will not be touched by evil in the afterlife, as they then take him away, and he dies a, relatively peaceful death for what he was about to experience. And that is where this location is now known as the Silent Vigil. And you return with Bradenbrad's belongings in a chest to Tyrion Fordring, and he mentions how he felt light leave this earth. And you tell him, like, all the details, like, yep, a doll came, they took his soul, and they promised me that he will not be corrupted. And the reason that this is, it's really bittersweet of an ending, but this whole quest line is actually a memorial for the man by the name of Bradford Bradenbecker, who is the brother of Blizzard's vice president of online technologies. And he was a super passionate WoW player who unfortunately just before Wrath of the Lich King passed away from cancer. And when Chris Metzen had heard about this, Chris Metzen had actually been at the funeral. He was like, we need to honor him. And he made it so that he had to have him as a main quest line in the WoW of Wrath of the Lich King. Like, you can kind of do a lot to fight against cancer. You can put in a ton of effort and whatnot. But, sometimes at the end of the day, cancer fucking sucks.
Damn, I did not know that's why the quest line is there. And that's the name of the guy we're talking about? Was the name of the character?
It's a little bit modified.
Oh, okay.
But yes, it's named after him. And you get this as well, because if you have the Wrath of the Lich King manual, you'll see under the special thanks section, Bradford C. Breadbracker. And I feel bad because it's kind of ending on a sad note, but like I said, I do think that's bittersweet because, in a way, his quest line lives on immortally within World of Warcraft all these years later. And we have the opportunity to at least get to know this person in a way. And that is, for the most part, all we have to talk about today. I did mention last episode I thought we were going to finish up with Icecrown today, but we did have actually a lot more to talk about in Zul'Drak and Sholazar Basin than I really remembered before researching this. So with the next episode, we will begin talking about things like the Argent tournament, as well as moving into the actual raid of Icecrown Citadel itself to face Arthas.
I think that Bradenbrad quest is pretty cool because it also shows that pretty much undeath is uncurable. You tried, you worked with, like, if there was a cure, one of those people probably could have found it, right? But there's no cure, right?
Well, it doesn't really seem like it. You had that original classic quest line where the Ashbringer purifies Fairbanks, but that's considered non-canon. And yeah, it is, like I said, just it's bittersweet to understand the full context of that quest line and just, how hard you can fight things and, the result of it at times. Mm-hmm. If you guys did make it this far, make sure you drop the comment about what your favorite thing is to do in WoW. Drop us a like if you did enjoy this episode as we move into the most likely final episode of Tides of Lore that takes place during the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. And just thank you guys for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you guys listening, commenting, and we will see you guys next week. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this episode. Your guys' support truly means the world to us. If you're interested in hearing more, we have our full show on YouTube and Spotify, new episodes dropping every Tuesday. I also want to take this moment to give a special thank you to Fantasy Lo-Fi for providing the music for this episode. You can find them on YouTube at Fantasy Lo-Fi or on Spotify under Bits and Hits. Be sure to show them some love as their music does truly bring this journey to life. Once again, thank you for joining us on Tides of Lore, and we will see you next week.